Natalie cleaned the last plate from a huge pile of dirty dishes and wiped her sweaty forehead with the sleeve of her dressing gown in relief. She always had enough work in an elite restaurant, where she had been working for 2 months. The responsibility of the young woman was not only cleaning the working area of the kitchen, but also collecting garbage and washing dishes daily after all the customers. In addition, Natalie had to sweep the restaurant's patio every morning, because the janitor hired from the management company was only responsible for keeping the front entrance clean. The woman received a very modest salary with all the responsibilities that lay on her. This was barely enough to more or less support 2 children and pay for rented housing. When Natalie came home in the evening, she could barely stand on her feet, and she had to cook something for the next day and help her little children with homework. Such a difficult situation for Natalie was explained by the fact that she was a single mother. Being an orphan from an orphanage, the girl always dreamt of a big friendly family and only then of a brilliant career. Shortly after graduating from the boarding school, she was lucky to meet her soulmate. It turned out to be a good, kind guy named Kevin. The young people got married, and after a while, Natalie gave birth to 2 twin boys from him. Peter and Victor were the main treasure of the family, and young parents did everything to provide the kids with everything they needed. Kevin worked hard. He worked as a taxi driver in the city car park. His parents were alcoholic, so they didn't have to rely on their support. However, the money he earned in taxis was barely enough for him to buy food and clothes for his small family. Natalie couldn't go to work as there was no one to sit with the children, and so all the concern for the financial support of his wife and sons fell on the shoulders of Kevin. The guy went to work in night shifts, trying to earn as much as possible. He worked illegally, bypassing the cash register. Taxi drivers always had a small percentage of the trip. One day, a young man accidentally fell asleep at the wheel from fatigue, because of which he got into a terrible accident in which he had no chance to survive. The death of her husband was a terrible blow for Natalie. The woman understood that now she was left alone with the harsh reality, without help or support. She left 2 young children, who by that time had just gone to 1st grade. Natalie began to earn money slowly in the most simple and low-paid positions, overcoming her own timidity and fear that she had to leave her sons alone at home. At first, she had to go around her neighborhood twice a day and scatter flyers and free city newspapers into mailboxes, or for example, post ads on special stands near public transport stops. She was paid little money, but such work helped Natalie's family to survive. 3 years have passed since the death of her husband. Every day, the young mother remembered her beloved Kevin. The memories of him and 2 beautiful sons helped Natalie not to give up. Working in a restaurant has become a real gift of fate for her. She received a small salary there, but much more than for putting up ads, and this was the most important thing for her at the time. She was already accustomed to various kinds of everyday difficulties, and therefore, the work of a dishwasher did not seem so terrible to her. The only thing Natalie constantly worried about was the attitude towards her sons at school. Young children were often teased for their poverty and simple modest things. Practical trousers and sweaters, the cheapest cotton shirts. Natalie's children dressed as unpretentiously as possible, and if something from the clothes was suddenly torn, the woman carefully mended the holes. The only thing Natalie couldn't handle was time. Her children inevitably grew up, and they needed new clothes and shoes of the appropriate size. The mother herself couldn't afford to buy even the simplest but new blouse, so she went around in old things that had already practically turned into cast-offs. Richer classmates who teased the brothers didn't understand that the family was forced to be content with the most modest against their will. Therefore, Natalie sometimes really wanted to take the twins from this school and transfer them somewhere far away to another school, where they would not be bullied because of their difficult economic status. But the woman understood that at the moment, she didn't have the opportunity to take her sons to another area. The school the boys went to was located next to the house, but the woman believed that one day they would still be able to escape from the endless circle of domestic problems, and she tried to console her nice boys. One day, when Natalie was cleaning the apartment, she noticed several plates of leftover food sitting in the corner of the kitchen next to the household waste bin. The woman took a closer look and was surprised to realize that these were not just leftovers from a cold meal. Many of these gourmet dishes were completely untouched. Obviously, customers paid for these meals and then, for some reason, refused them, and now the uneaten products were in danger of going to the trash. Half-eaten meals included more than cold starters, cheese platters, and salads. There were side dishes of cereals and pasta and a couple of soups and even mashed potatoes. Natalie suddenly heard a loud growl in her stomach. The poor dishwasher hadn't eaten since last night. She had given the last leftover porridge to her children for dinner, and now she looked at the plates of food with undisguised appetite. Natalie looked around, stood for a few seconds and thought, and then resolutely took a couple of empty plastic containers from the refrigerator and quickly put the rest of the great food in them. The young woman thought that today, her children would not starve or eat empty porridge on the water. Today, they would eat enough. That evening, for the first time in their lives, the twins tasted cheese and real meat sausage. The children emptied the containers of treats that their mother had brought for them with incredible speed. Natalie cried with happiness, seeing how a healthy and well-fed blush slowly appears on the pale, always thin faces of her children. She herself was able to eat only a couple of spoons of mashed potatoes. So strong were the feelings that overwhelmed her. Since then, every evening, Natalie quietly took the dishes left by the guests of the restaurant and took them home to feed her sons. Of course, the woman took only what the visitors of the establishment refused. It was not in her thoughts to take what was left being prepared for extradition. Customers who refused paid meals at the restaurant didn't lose anything. The fact is that the main visitors of the restaurant were very wealthy people, for whom the refusal of a paid dish was truly a small matter. Such guests could spend a large sum in one evening in a restaurant. At the same time, Natalie adopted a homeless dog she found in a garbage yard near her home. The dog was very beautiful and obedient. His shaggy ears were constantly twitching in different directions, as if the dog was trying to grab all the sounds at once and not miss a single event around him. The dog's black eyes gleamed playfully whenever she saw Natalie or her twins. At first, the woman fed the street dog, but then the children persuaded her to take her home. Moreover, at that time, Natalie herself had already managed to become attached to the animal. Chef Toby and the waitresses from the restaurant chuckled at Natalie. They didn't know about the presence of her children. They only heard about the dog, and therefore they believed that she was bringing the leftover food to the dog. For several months, everything was fine, and then suddenly the restaurant changed hands. Mr. Smith became the new owner of the restaurant. He was young and ambitious, but suffered from an obsessive desire to control everything and everyone. The businessman was afraid that his new restaurant would be constantly robbed by his employees. Mr. Smith installed several video cameras throughout the establishment, trying to stop possible theft in the bud, and he personally observed the workers when he had the opportunity. One evening, when the owner stayed longer than usual at work, he saw on the monitor how Natalie puts the leftovers of food left by the customers in containers and goes home. The restaurateur was struck by such, from his point of view, blatant impudence. He immediately summoned the chef and began his interrogation, pointing to the recording. "Toby, what is this? I raised your salary as you asked. And you have a dishwasher which easily takes food out of the kitchen? Do you allow her? And on what basis?" The chef turned pale. He didn't expect the headmaster to get so angry over some leftovers. Toby began hesitantly. "Mr. Smith, these leftovers cannot actually be considered products. They would still go to the trash can in the morning. She can at least feed her dog with this food." Suddenly, Toby seemed to realize something and quickly added, "No, I don't know. Maybe she's dragging something else from the kitchen. Natalie is almost always the last to leave." And the chef eloquently fell silent. The owner released Toby and thought that the only way to stop the increasing theft would be his personal attempt right now to come to this woman and shame her, and threatened to fire her if necessary. The businessman found out Natalie's home address from the personnel department. He got into his car and went to her house. On the way, the owner rehearsed for a long time a speech in which he would shame a woman for her petty theft. "What are you doing? How can you steal food from a restaurant kitchen so easily? Maybe they are leftovers for which the full amount of the bill has already been paid. But how can you feed this to a dog? This is quite good waste, from which something else could be done. Added somewhere to minimize cooking costs. Now after all crisis and the prices for products very high, and you steal from everyone under their noses and plunder controlled funds, so to speak." The businessman didn't notice how his car stopped on the very outskirts of the city, and the squalid poorest of the districts near the old house. The owner of the restaurant climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell of her apartment uncertainly. A second later, Natalie opened the door, holding back the dog that barked with joy. The woman looked in surprise at such a late visitor. Mr. Smith began in a businesslike manner. "Good evening. Do I understand correctly that you are Natalie?" She continued to look at him with a silent question in her eyes. Finally, the dumbfounded woman said, "Yes, it's me. And who are you?" Natalie hadn't seen the new boss yet, so she didn't know what he looked like. "Forgive me for visiting you at this hour. I'm your new owner, Mr. Smith. I need to have a very serious conversation with you. May I come in?" All this time, the dog continued to bark. Natalie barely managed to calm the animal before she could let the businessman inside. When he found himself in the corridor with peeling wallpaper and an old electric floor lamp instead of a chandelier, he immediately understood the complexity of his employee's situation. Mr. Smith saw a small square kitchen, in which, to his great surprise, two twins were sitting, happily finishing off the same food leftovers from the restaurant. The owner said in amazement, "How so? Do you have children?" Natalie calmly replied, "Yes, as you can see. Didn't you know?" Mr. Smith turned pale. "No, forgive me. I've come to you with a reprimand. I thought that you were stealing food from the kitchen and feeding the rootless dog with good leftovers. I didn't think you were doing this for kids." The landlady smiled mirthlessly. "And for whom else? Our guests barely tasted these dishes, and at the end of the shift, I or Toby still had to dispose of them. Understand me, I would never go for this if it were for ready meals. But after all, customers refused them, having previously paid for the order. The restaurant doesn't suffer any losses in terms of money." Mr. Smith felt insanely ashamed. He modestly apologized and quietly left Natalie's apartment at that very moment. The next day, the owner issued a large bonus to the single mother, and from that day on, he tried to help her in every possible way. Over time, Natalie and the owner were imbued with each other, first friendly and then more serious feelings. Natalie understood that Mr. Smith was unlikely to replace the father of her children, but he was a very good person. He tried to minimize losses in his own institution. The thief of good products was eventually found. It turned out to be the same chef, Toby. The man often liked to play cards with his friends. As a result, he owed them a large sum of money. The cook had no way to repay the debt in cash, so he began to steal delicacies from the kitchen. Thus, he tried to repay the debt. In the end, Toby was figured out by CCTV cameras when he took out the sturgeon, obtained with such difficulty a couple of days before from the refrigerator. After the incident, the chef was immediately fired. The owner of the restaurant couldn't forgive his employee for such frank hypocrisy. Relations between Natalie and Mr. Smith began to develop rapidly. The young restaurateur was seriously considering marrying a sweet and kind-hearted woman and adopting her children. Now they all lived together in a large, spacious apartment of the owner of the restaurant, whose heart turned out to be completely free. He recently divorced his wife because of her infidelity with his best friend. Now, after a while, the businessman was ready again for a serious relationship. So he chose the pure and unselfish love of Natalie, and not the daughter of some wealthy investor.